The reason I'm excited to welcome everyone is a very special session based on ICCCAD and BIGD's joint work. ICCCAD is the International Center for Climate Change and Development. BIGD is the BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. So this session is based on our joint editorship of the upcoming special issue of the journal Agriculture for Development. This issue was inspired by Hugh Brammer's work in Bangladesh. He sadly passed away last year after spending over 60 years working here as a geographer and soil scientist. This special issue includes contributions from his longtime friends and colleagues, but also from new researchers from Bangladesh. We felt that it was important to share Hugh Brammer's work, not only his work, but also his research ethos, and to project it forward what it means for the challenges facing Bangladesh and the world today. Hugh's ethos embraced and accommodated the natural complexities of Bangladesh, which is crucial for our current challenge. What is also, I feel, a crucial takeaway from his work is his commitment to evidence-based research, not just to gain insights into the complexities of our reality, but to also then apply it for effective interventions. And in that dialectic between doing and learning and doing lies the key in identifying solutions that would work for a changing climate. This combining of action and research means that doers have to also be our teachers, people whose lives and livelihoods are most tied to the elements, to the soil, to the water, and the climate, can teach us best what will work on the ground. And for us researchers in this panel, we recognize that the fundamental challenge in our line of work is bridging the gap between research and how changes happen in an increasingly complex real world. The dynamics of interaction between climate change and underlying environmental and socioeconomic trends are often not clear cut. We tend to gloss over some of these differences, attribute changes to things to get away from some of that complexity. But through our exploration of Hugh's research, we learned to place climate change action agenda within the larger socioeconomic reality faced by people in their everyday lives. We seek to use ground-up approach and rigorous field research to work on this challenge. In this, we are inspired by Hugh's approach to knowledge, embracing contextual complexities and commitment to serious research and scholarship in order to influence policy and practice. With this, I turn to our esteemed panelist and presenter, David Dent. David is a member of the Tropical Agriculture Association. He's a soil surveyor and an independent scientist. He was formerly director of ISRIC, World Soil Information. I realize I skipped over my introduction. I'm Rohini Kamal. I'm a research fellow at BIGD. With that, I turn to David.
Thank you, Rohini. Yes, first and foremost, Hugh was my friend for certainly 50 years. Not just friend, but probably also guru to all soil surveyors. Hugh was one of the beginners and never stopped doing it. And Hugh had a very simple message. It's not all the same out there. He was a soil surveyor, so he knew that out there are many different kinds of soil. Each and every one is a different world, as different as Bangladesh and India, as different as Camilla and Jessore, as different as a rice paddy and a wheat field. Each world has its own special resources and its own unique inhabitants. This has lots of implications. The first is that each world needs special care and individual management. Now, a soil surveyor can distinguish different soils by their appearance, their feel, smell, sound, taste, like any other living thing. Sometimes it helps to measure other things, like reaction and conductivity. But essentially, we recognize soils like we recognize anything else, a dog, a cat, or whatever. In Hugh's day, and I guess my day, both past, we all believed in planning. And we all believed that maps showing the distribution of different kinds of soils would be useful in development projects and in farm management. We certainly found that big projects that were undertaken without this information had been costly failures. So a new profession opened up to us, digging holes, and while we're at it, recording the characteristics of the soils. As we dug our way across the landscape, something remarkable happened. As soon as we appeared, so did the farmer, immediately, wanting to know what we were looking for. The ensuing dialogue, however, was a source of information that you can't get out of books. We got it from practitioners. What will grow where, what not? How do different crops do in a drought or in a flood on different soils? And all the problems that farmers face and how they think something might be done about them. Over weeks and months and years, working in different places, a soil surveyor builds up a comprehensive picture of the land and the people, which is some qualification for identifying agricultural development possibilities. Now, Hugh was engaged to lead the East Pakistan wing of the Pakistan Soil Survey in 1961, hot foot from the Gold Coast. He lost no time in learning Bangla so that he could talk to the farmers, or talk with the farmers rather. And he soon appreciated that they knew far more about the land, their land, than he could ever hope to know. When the soil survey was finished, it took about 10 years, Hugh went home, but in 1974, he was invited back to a newly independent Bangladesh to advise the Secretary of Agriculture, Mr. Ansuzaman. Sorry about the pronunciation, sir. Anyhow, the pair of them worked very closely together for a good 13 years on a range of policy issues. And Hugh enjoyed a privilege accorded to very few of us soil surveyors, the chance to put our recommendations into practice and perhaps amend them. And he kept doing it. All that marked his official retirement in 1987 was the award of a few medals. He just continued working on Bangladesh, closely involved in major issues like the Flood Action Plan, and with Peter Robinscroft, a major global synthesis of arsenic pollution that had come up since his day. And at least for this morning, finally, he was constantly goaded by other people's misunderstandings and sometimes by a lack of action on unresolved issues. And he brought out a series of 10 major books on Bangladesh, covering pretty well everything he thought people really ought to know. And he thought they did know, but since they obviously didn't, he did it again. Many of those issues are still unresolved. So I'd just like to go through a few of them this morning, or this afternoon, rather, for you, in case you want to pick them up in discussion. His first book was The Geography of Soils of Bangladesh, published in 1996. This handbook summarizes about 70,000 recorded soil observations, grouped into 574 soil series within 18 agroecological zones. He talks about their suitability, their limitations for different uses, and also some of the things that came up in the soil survey that were not really expected. The first thing was that the fertility of the soils of Bangladesh didn't come from annual deposition of fertile silt. All of that ended up in the Bay of Bengal. The annual flooding, which happens, is simply monsoon rainfall pondered back by high river levels. Another issue that came up was that the soil pattern is so complex that individual soil series can only be mapped on village maps at a scale of 1 to 3 or 4,000. And the 1 to 115,000 nationwide soil survey only depicts geographical soil associations. And something which Hugh recalled more than once, with me anyhow, was during his time in Bangladesh and subsequently, the farmers tripled their production without any reference whatever to his soil maps. Now, the next book, following the year after, Agricultural Development Possibilities, explains how to assess crop suitability and other development issues. One of the pearls of wisdom that appears towards the end is that these assessments must change as new cultivars are introduced, as irrigation, drainage, and flood protection is implemented. That's inconvenient for officialdom, but it's a fact. Hugh also observed the many canny ways that the farmers of Bangladesh, over the generations, have been able to reduce their risks in diversified production. And he was forever urging the planners to draw on this knowledge of their farmers, harness this knowledge, not only of the farmers, but locally elected representatives, to get around or solve, if possible, the difficult human constraints that so often impede development. Soils aren't difficult to deal with. You know where you are with soils. People are something else. And again, there's been a tradition in Bangladesh of top-down management. Not just in Bangladesh, many places. But Hugh was forever saying, well, look, there's all that knowledge out there. The farmers know a lot more than I do. I'm getting paid for it. They're just doing it every day. Make use of it. These local elected representatives know a thing or two about their area. Make use of that. Another gripe he had, which he brought up in agricultural development management, and again, drawn from his own experience of managing agricultural disasters that happened from time to time while he was with you, was that it's mainly farmers who suffer from these natural disasters. But agricultural officials are excluded from the so-called integrated teams responsible for emergency operations. So Hugh sat down and wrote a complete methodology for agricultural emergency planning. No detail is too small for Hugh to include. They're all mattered. It's a brilliant piece of work. He then moved on to agricultural aspects of research and development. Now, that was published in 2000, and it's definitely dated now. Things have moved on a long way, but some things are still with us. They're always with us. First of all, the sheer complexity of the Bangladeshi landscapes, the minute details, which are really, really important. Every inch above or below flood level really matters. Every week above or below flood level really matters. Then you've got the many, many farmers to be dealt with, the fragmentation of the holdings, and I'll say it again, the top-down arrogance, which is always with us. Characteristically, Hugh also acknowledged the farmer's own adaptive research. If necessity is the mother of invention, then we would expect a great deal of ingenuity to be exhibited in Bangladeshi farming. And it is. It is. The farmers are not so dependent on official research and extension as international donors and researchers and extensionists like to believe. Hugh and I both spent most of our careers on what became known as land use planning. And Hugh has a book on land use and land use planning, which was published in 2003. Rather wistfully, I think, he describes land use planning as we saw it in the golden age. That's when we were young. It culminated in Bangladesh in moves to decentralize planning to the local level. Hugh was all for that, and he produced two quite remarkable local level planning manuals, written just like a motorcycle manual, a motorcycle maintenance manual, so that even the most junior official could do as well as the most senior official, and would bring him almost to the level of the farmer. Well, this only annoyed all the senior officials, who strangled the initiative at birth. In the event, the march of neoliberal economics swept land use planning and Hugh and me into history. And government subsequently relied on free markets, or what we might call free for all, to deliver the goods. But there's, again, a lot in that volume which certainly still worth reading. I'd like to finish with two issues raised by Hugh's later books, which will remain pertinent, particularly to this meeting and these institutions. Those are protection from floods and climate change. The last 3 or 4 books that Hugh wrote demonstrate, number one, the country is not flat. Floods affect different places differently. Floods in Bangladesh are not caused by deforestation in the Himalayas. An issue which is still live, I think, that rapid climate change is not happening in Bangladesh. Floods, cyclones, droughts aren't becoming more frequent. Sea level rise is, however, happening in Bangladesh. But sea level rise in this century will not necessarily flood the country contour by contour. It won't displace 10 or 20 or 30 million people, certainly not in this century. This was deduced from line by line, item by item analysis by a retired gentleman working in Cambridge on his own on all the climatic data that had been collected in Bangladesh since his day, and he initiated most of it. Every item was carefully checked. Anything which was dubious was left out. and his conclusions were this: there's hardly any change to climate in Bangladesh at the moment. However, Bangladesh is still subject to the sea level going up because Arctic and Antarctic ice are melting. But he would argue, he did argue strongly, that Bangladesh is not helpless in face of sea level rise. More than that, it has more urgent issues of climate change to attend to. In particular, feeding and employing the burgeoning population. You know as well as I, better than I, the numbers of people involved. Agriculture can't possibly employ them. If they are to be usefully employed, that means investment in education, skills, and infrastructure development. And any shortfall in food production can be made good by imports, providing the money is coming in to pay for them. So the big issue really is employment, useful, gainful, enjoyable employment of the people of Bangladesh. And from that, they will earn their living in the world and pay for anything that they can't grow themselves. I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I think, can people hear me? I just switched to my headphones. Okay, great, perfect. So I think we really benefited from the experience over the last 6 decades. Now we turn to younger researchers. We start with ICCCAD's presentation and work. So just to quickly go over this, so the first presentation will be by ICCCAD. It is an extensive review of material relating to land use, land cover, agriculture, and impacts of climate change in Bangladesh. This will be followed by a presentation by BIGD, which looks at perceived climate impacts and compares it to what reports have included as climate impacts in Bangladesh. So I turn to Savio, and you have 10 minutes for the presentation. I would ask everyone to note down their comments and questions and maybe share it with us and ask the presenters at the end of the presentations and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor, and a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, to all the viewers who are here and listening to us. So am I being audible and my screen is being shared? Can you all see my screen?
Yes,
yes,
you can see it.
All right, thank you. So today I would like to talk about research that we did a couple of months ago, me and my colleagues from my organization. We had Dr. Ali Rizai and Professor Mizanar Khan with me in this research, and it titled as Insights of Land Use, Agricultural, Food Security in Bangladesh, Way Forward with Climate Change and Development. This is how our outline looks for today's presentation. At the very beginning, I'll be giving a glance of Bangladesh and about our research. I'll be talking about the agriculture sector of the country, the social challenges, the climate change and agricultural perspective, the existing measures, study findings, and finally the way forward. So moving forward, to begin with, as we all know that Bangladesh is boosting with various development measures, and in terms of agricultural sector, where 13% of the GDP comes from this sector, which is also an important field for the country's economy. And we have a land area around 56,177 square miles. It's a very tiny area in terms of the population that we hold. So typically that this huge population is being concentrated in this small area, so that creates a challenge. So that actually took us to think about our research, where we already have the rapid population growth, then we also have the socio-economical challenges, and finally now over the past few decades we are talking about climate change that is happening here. So these were crossing our minds, and so we thought of like, why don't we do something? Let us think about writing a paper on this, and then we got this brilliant opportunity to write something for agriculture for development. And this is how actually we thought. First of all, we thought about the past, present, and future scenario of the agriculture sector in our country. Then we took the socio-economical challenges. We had the impacts of climate change on agriculture. And finally, we looked at the existing measure, the gaps, and the way forward. It was a very simple and straightforward research. So if we consider the methodology, we did some systematic literature review by finding keywords from secondary literature, which included the peer-reviewed journals, international NGO reports, case studies, newspaper, policy briefs. And then what we did is we shortlisted this literature, and finally we had 56 literature and 12 national policies to be reviewed and to produce our paper. From the existing literature that we found and the updated ones, we tried to develop a couple of graphs and data analysis. And from our land, we also plan to do a land use land cover map. And for this, we use the Landsat 8 satellite image. And if we go to the next slide, where we are actually talking about the agricultural sector of Bangladesh and how important it is for the country. As you see that agricultural sector actually addresses the food security, the livelihood, and the economic growth of our country. And also it helps to alleviate poverty. And according to a report by World Bank, we see that 90% of the product poverty was reduced in Bangladesh from 2005 to 2010, because as people were involved in this sector. And yet 65% of the people in the country, directly or indirectly, they are dependent on this sector. And it is also the primary source of income for 87% rural community. And as I mentioned, that 13% of the GDP comes from this sector. And from this graph, from our literatures, we found this data, and we can see that the production and also the demand is increasing day by day. However, the amount of arable land is decreasing. So this was one of our findings from the literature. And if we move to the next slide, we see there are social challenges that are influencing this sector. And we found out 4 social challenges that are actually which were aiding to for the arable land to be decreased. The first one was population growth, and it is predicted that by 2051, the country will be reaching to a population of 245 million if there is a high fertility rate scenario. And we also find that the rapid urbanization is a big problem here, as every year we are losing around 80,000 hectares of land, arable land. And then the third challenge that we found, that the agricultural land fragmentation, especially in the rural families, where the big families are breaking down into nuclear families, and the land area is being divided among the family members. So that is a problem in terms of agricultural production. And finally, we found another challenge that comes as a conversion of agricultural land for infrastructural development. And here I would like to use the word unsustainable and the infrastructural development, which are actually taking place, especially and is being expanded in the rural areas. So from our land use land cover map, we try to focus on Dhaka Zilla, where we find that in the year 2014, the amount of arable land were more. However, by the end of 2020, there was a rapid urbanization, and there were more built-in area covering the paddy fields and fallow lands. Now let's consider the disasters that are taking place, as David had mentioned in his statement, that Bangladesh, here we face a lot of disasters which are quite common, which are not because of our geographic location. We have cyclones every year, almost every year. We have floods because the GBM Delta is also situated here. We have flash floods in the northeastern side. We also witness drought from the northwest, and we have sea level rise and salinity intrusion. But the problem is when we are putting in climate change into this equation, as the very recent IPCC report, it states that for the Southern Asian region, that the heat wave and extreme temperature events will be more frequent. There will be extensive rainfall. The marine heat wave will increase, which will also lead to more cyclones. And we will also have a sea level rise than the global average. So as agriculture sector is very sensitive to weather and climatic conditions, so all these factors should be considered right now. And we also have, as we have mentioned, that disasters are very common in our country. So the farmers, those who are tackling the disaster, they have developed some of their very own technology. And in our research paper, we try to find those technology. We try to segregate them into four measures. The first comes the application of interventions, then we have structural, then the non-structural, and finally the research and innovation, which is done more by the scientific community. However, the structural, non-structural measure, most of them, they originate from the local level. So we have a very famous technology, which is renowned worldwide, which is also known as the floating agricultural technology. So this is kind of a common practice in many parts of our country, especially which are flood-prone areas. Our study finding also states that we have like rapid population growth right now. We have economic growth, unplanned development. We also have to consider the climate change impacts that is threatening the agricultural sector. And there has been a transformative change from agro-based economy to pre-industrialized economy. And this is actually threatening the agricultural sector and also the food production to meet the demand, as we are predicting that we are going to reach around 245 million by the end of 2050. So it surely comes as a challenge for us, like how are we going to meet this demand? We also need to consider that people are actually changing their occupation because of this frequent natural disasters. So many farmers, as they are not getting a good harvest or they are not being benefited, they are changing their occupation from farming to other jobs. So that is also need to be considered. But despite of all these factors, we are still we also have some positive factors, that we are first in jute production and export. We are second in the world in jackfruit production. We are third for freshwater fish and vegetable production. We are fourth in rice production, and finally we are sixth on the potato production. So these were the way forwards from our research, from our paper. So the first and foremost was to safeguard and incentivize the small farmers, as they are more vulnerable comparing to other farmers, because the rich farmers or the mid-level farmers, even if they lose something out of the natural disasters, they have something to grab, or they can change their occupation, or they can invest money into some other sectors. But think about the small farmers, those who have nothing to cope with or to have for. So if a disaster strikes, then they lose everything. So we need to safeguard and incentivize their measures. Secondly, we also need to recognize and mainstream the local knowledge that they possess, which then, and also like Hugh Brammer, he has mentioned again and again in his works, that we need to acknowledge their adaptive measures. We need to know more from them. And also with this comes the financial and technical support. If we can provide them the technical and financial support and scale up their indigenous and local knowledges, then that might help us to get a sustainable agricultural practice. And finally, we also have climate information services for farmers. For example, we can introduce farmer school, farmer support centers, and farmer markets, where they can promote their products and they can have a reasonable value. Because in Africa, this practice is already there, the farmer school practices. So we can also promote something that similar in our country. And we can also do an extensive research on climate smart crops to reduce the GHG emission that can help to mitigate the climate change, and we can contribute to some extent. And finally, enhancing the institutional and community capacity. Then again, this also includes safeguarding the small farmers. And finally, update basic facilities in suburban areas and rural areas, so that the farmers, they don't have to move from the villages to the major cities like Dhaka or Chittagong or Khulna. Rather, they can find all the necessary facilities that they want in the nearby cities, in the city centers. So I think that's all from my end. Thank you so much for your time. Over to you, Yapu, if you're there.
Sure, of course. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. We now turn to Adiba from BIGD to give her presentation.
So I think I'm struggling with presenting or sharing my screen. Savio, would it be okay for you to share my presentation? It's available in the folder.
Okay.
Oh no, it's on again.
Yes,
Never
All right.
mind.
Okay.
I got it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can everybody see my screen?
It's loading. I think. Yes.
Yes, yes, we can.
Yeah.
So good day, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm Adiba Narisha from BRAC Institute of Governance and Development. I'll be presenting our paper on perceptions of climate change across the different climatic risk zones in Bangladesh to be published in the ACFORDEF 44 issue. So to give a bit of background on what we're essentially discussing in the paper is that the need for climate change adaptation has been made very clear and established in many different studies, in particular for countries like Bangladesh, which has like rising sea levels and storm surges. But adapting to climate change essentially requires awareness, and that is something that we explored in this study, whether the communities are sufficiently aware of the climate risk that they may face. And what we found was that communities at the front line are already facing severe challenges, especially those that depend on agriculture, livestock, fisheries, and forest products. And therefore, successful adaptation depends a lot on keen awareness of the risks in order to respond appropriately and guard against them. But what we found in our study was that awareness about specific risks from climate change, it can vary, and communities across the countries might not necessarily have equal access to the information or the debate around climate change. So that led us to a hunt for studies on climate risk perceptions, and we found that there was no nationwide study done on climate risk perception. There were a few studies that have focused on one area or a smaller sample, let's say, or even on a specific topic, such as there was one on public health impacts of climate change. So it pointed us towards the need for a nationwide study in order to measure awareness of the risk. And this is particularly relevant for some of the perceived risks of climate change in Bangladesh, given that these risks are inseparable from the baseline climate conditions, which are essentially high temperature, cyclones, floods, and heavy rainfall. So to introduce a bit about the paper, what we have done is that in the study, we have identified that this is the largest and only nationally representative assessment of the felt impacts of climate change and environmental variations in Bangladesh. We used a nationally representative data set across all 64 districts. This was a 2017.
I think there was probably some issue with the Wi-Fi, so I'll just quickly try and get Adiba back on track. I do apologize for the interruption. It's, I guess it's making everyone wonder what's coming next. So we'll be back in a second.
Oh, dear.
So while we're waiting, I just, as we listen to Adiba's presentation, as we listen to Savio's presentation, also keeping in mind that there is a need for communication to perhaps the communities, but also a need for communication from what the experience of communities are and people are to the reports that we had referred to. And as we listen to everyone's conversations, maybe what I would ask everyone is to try and connect some of the issues that have kept coming up, starting with what David had said, the variations, that everything is not the same. There are so many variations. How do we accommodate? What systems can better accommodate those variations? What systems can accommodate learning from and listening to people who are most familiar with changes in their climatic conditions and their water and soil, and also how to best accommodate some of the more immediate challenges as they interact with impacts from increasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So of course, there is increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere because of human activities, but there are also immediate human activities that perhaps shape a lot of the realities. So these three challenges, to broadly think about these three challenges as we listen to the presentations and the speakers. Adiba, you've joined us in the meantime, so I'll let you resume. Thanks. Adiba, can you hear me? Okay, I think perhaps we can circle back to the presentation towards the end. I'll just quickly share what the paper and the presentation was focusing on. We were looking to, as we know that the climate and the environmental situation all over Bangladesh isn't the same. There are variations across. We tried to find what these changes are that can be attributable to climate change and what some of the variations are from reports, from international reports. We used the latest IPCC report, and we used national reports on climate change and identify different climate risk zones where certain changes are more pronounced. So increase in temperature, increase in certain kinds of flooding, pluvial, and maybe not riverine flooding from the IPCC, but IPCC did talk about pluvial and coastal flooding, and trying to see if people from those risk zones also report perceived increase in those aspects, so temperature or flooding or precipitation changes. And not only that, because the data set that we used included questions on what kind of changes people have seen in the last 10 years compared to the previous decades. We have a whole host of different kind of changes that were reported. So using that, we could first, so what we did was we looked at all the regions in Bangladesh, then we categorized them according to different increased risk zones, so increased temperature zones, increased flooding zones, etc. And then looked at the responses from people from those zones to see if their perceived risks correspond to what the national reports were saying. And in Adiba, are you back with us? Hi, Adiba, can you hear me?
Hi, Apple, can you hear me?
Yes, I would, because we're kind of short on time, I would ask you if you can present, but maybe focus on just the findings and the conclusions, perhaps.
Sure.
I do not
think
want to impose on everyone's time.
Yeah, of course. As you can see, my laptop isn't working very well. So would it be okay if someone else could share my presentation, Savio, if that's okay?
Yes, I'm on it. I think just give me some time. I'm on it.
I sincerely apologize to everyone for bearing with us.
Nice, Harry. Nice, Harry. That's a good boy.
David, do we have someone else interested in our presentation as well? Did someone else join us?
No, I was conversing with my dog.
I think your dog is interested in our presentation.
He's very interested. Yes, well, he's a very intelligent dog. And he's very fond of company. He's hearing all these young voices and saying, this is much more fun than being at home with you.
I'm sure he's not. Savio,
He is.
do you want to share the presentation, or should we just?
I'm having some trouble from my end as well, but there I'm trying to put it up.
Well, maybe we can continue with the panel discussion and then maybe the presentation at the end.
Sure.
I think that absolutely makes sense. So again, the presentation was more on perception of climate change, if that matches with what the reports are saying, and if there is need on one hand to inform people of the risks, and on the other hand to inform policymakers, and when if the reports actually reflect the reality. So that was basically what that presentation spoke to. I now turn to our panelists. We will first hear from David, who I will ask David to put on his soil specialist hat. What we want to really comment on is this interaction between climate change, socioeconomic challenges, having policy that reflects some of these realities on ground, and connect that to the experts on soil, water, and climate change. We'll be hearing from people with great expertise in soil, in water, and climate change. David, do you want to put on your soil specialist hat now and maybe speak to your experience of how some of the current challenges speak to your many decades of experience in Bangladesh, especially some of, you mentioned the characteristics of soil, the importance of planning and soil mapping, how that reality can be accommodated within some of the interventions in infrastructure and maybe the changes brought in by climate change, how the importance of incorporating that into the larger conversation. If in the interest of time, I would request you to limit your comments to maybe 8 minutes.
I can't even usefully comment for 8 minutes. I have two things to say, though. In 1969, 4 of us at the University of East Anglia, Norwich in England, discovered climate change. At least we thought we had. As it turns out, it had been discovered earlier in 1965, and President Lyndon Johnson had been briefed on it by his scientists in 1965, but we weren't there at the time. And President Lyndon Johnson had the issue of the Vietnam War to worry about, and so it didn't get any further. So in 1969, 4 of us who were working on a school textbook saw the data from Hawaii showing the increase in the carbon dioxide concentration. And I said, well, we're not going to have another ice age. 3 or 4 years later, we had a colleague whose mathematics was good enough to translate that into a reasonable model, a prediction of just how much warmer it was going to get, and when. And we then started jumping up and down. So by about 1975, we convinced ourselves that there was such a thing as climate change. And we've been jumping up and down very hard ever since. And no one took any notice for decades. We didn't know where to shout. We didn't know how loudly to shout. We did everything we could to bring this attention to people. And we didn't really get anywhere. And then quite suddenly, and I don't know why, everybody was talking about climate change. And climate change was responsible for everything, even for what it wasn't responsible for. And this is where Hugh came in. Hugh got very cross at this because Hugh had looked at the Bangladesh data awfully carefully and said there was no climate change in Bangladesh, which was pretty nearly true. There is a change, but it's not very much, and it's nothing like as much as in the Arctic or the Antarctic. So there's always an issue of evidence base. You brought it up in the introduction, the evidence base. First of all, what is your evidence? Where does it lead you? And Hugh got very cross because people were not being led by the evidence, they were being led by I think that's still an issue. Look very hard at what change you are actually going to get where you are and how you can respond to it, rather than change elsewhere that other people are going to have to respond to it. In Bangladesh, it's hard to know, it's hard to find any agricultural response. It's even hard to decide what it might be. One response that is possible, and I think desirable if you can manage it, is, I think it's called precision agriculture now. That is, bearing in mind your enormous variability, bring that into developments of adoptions of new varieties or new procedures which work in each individual little square that you're working with. That might well be going back to those old soil maps and making use of that information and responding in fine detail. One thing which I also haven't seen in Bangladesh is very much adoption of what is called conservation agriculture. The big thing in the big grain growing areas is stopping ploughing. Ploughing is a hugely destructive thing and farmers shouldn't do it. They've been ploughing for 12,000 years and they've caused 12,000 years of damage to the soil, which the soil can't really bear with. If you stop ploughing and stop churning it up, things work better. Just think how your household would work if every year you were turned upside down and dropped on the floor. Well, that's what happens to the soil every year if you plough. If you can leave it alone and let these individual populations that I talked to earlier, the individual inhabitants, your unique inhabitants of every soil, get on with their job that they've spent millions of years evolving for, they're likely to do better than if you're constantly disturbed. So one thing which you might have a go at is ways of less destructive tillage. But I haven't seen any signs of progress with the adoption of that in Bangladesh. It's certainly worth a try.
Thank you so much, David. At this point, could I request Savio to allow, Kareem has joined us, so give him access to be able to comment and join us as not a participant, but as a moderator. Savio, could you please do that?
Yes, sir. I did.
Okay. Now we've heard from a soil expert. Now we turn to Peter Robinscroft. We are so happy that you could join us. Peter Robinscroft trained as a hydrogeologist and has worked for over 30 years in groundwater resources, water supply, and environmental management. He has authored and co-authored papers and books on global arsenic pollution and groundwater resources in Bangladesh. Peter first met Hugh in Bangladesh and later collaborated on the global study of arsenic at Cambridge University. I now turn to Peter and a similar request to perhaps keep it within 8 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohini. Thank you, everybody. And I have to obviously, I think, begin by talking about Hugh Brammer, who, as you mentioned, I met in '88 and was already a legend. I think I would like to draw some attention, perhaps the audience, that of course his status. Don't worry, David. My dog might burst in at any moment.
You've got a big chest.
We welcome his inputs. I think it makes our conversation richer. So don't worry about
indeed.
it.
But Hugh was not only a sort of legend in the agriculture and soils. He was so well known and influential on many, many others, in particular the water and the whole water and engineering area, even the pure geology people from the Geological Surveys of Bangladesh and the United States, all knew and engaged in Hugh. And I think what David has talked about Hugh's, and you have spoken about, Hugh's ethos and his attention to building a story from the base, from understanding the reality. He would be, of course, he would be horrified if any study had not done a literature search first and you hadn't learned from previous experience. But perhaps what you would object to most strongly is any sort of top-down imposition of ideas, whether it's sort of scientific or political. It very much showed in the response to climate change, and he would get quite angry, as David pointed out, when people have read some international report that says climate change is happening and it will do this, this, and that to the world, without people looking at the evidence on the ground. What is the response of this? And differentiating that from what is happening locally and the human interactions on that. And the other thing was, he was never afraid to take on anything new, whether that was, learning how to use a spreadsheet in his mid-80s, or it was about taking up the issue of arsenic. Now, Hugh had worked on the ground for 30 odd years in Bangladesh with the soil survey, completely oblivious, as with everybody else in the country, to the existence of arsenic. And people may have seen symptoms, doctors saw symptoms, but didn't bother to attend to them because they're specialists in different aspects of medicine, and nobody was looking for arsenic. They weren't simply saying what's wrong with that person. The same applies with agriculture. And it soon became apparent that arsenic was a major issue for agriculture. And this annoyed Hugh because he then dedicated himself for about, significant part for about 10 years to say he had to put right that and contribute to it, to learn, because he was not going to run away from this or hide or deny it, as has happened in other quarters. And he would be asking the people here today and throughout the agriculture sector, why haven't you done a comprehensive survey of arsenic in irrigation wells and in the soils and in the crops? Because this is critical to sustainability. And he would be concerned about the fact that when you look in parts of Faridpur and other areas, farmers are abandoning rice growing because of arsenic accumulation that's called phytotoxicity. Though they didn't abandon it because it's accumulating in the food chain. They didn't even know that, of course. And I think he would also be calling, I'm certain he would be calling on you to think how to engage with the sort of the political dimension of the agriculture sector. You probably, most of you are familiar with the famous little brass statues, the brass monkeys. See no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. And he would be horrified in what has happened in this sector for many years, which is see no arsenic, hear no arsenic, speak no arsenic in agriculture, and would call on you and find out how, if you can't just simply debate and win directly with people at the top, but how to engage in this, in building that knowledge base and sharing the information, and particularly drawing out those experiences of farmers, the on the ground data that can't be dismissed and allow you to be bullied in that way. And so this was my background to working with Hugh, and he was a co-author of the textbook on that, and several papers on arsenic in agriculture. And he was very conscious of the threat that this poses to the future of food production, for livelihoods, for farmers, and would call on that. But the general message beyond that is about learning from the ground up, avoiding those top-down approach, those top-down diktats, and building on the knowledge of farmers, so that the messages that go out, if they're grounded in the experience of people in the field, cannot actually be dismissed by anybody just making a grand speech or a note to the newspapers or the TVs, because people know what is happening. Farmers, as David said, know far more about their local conditions than we will ever know. And if we build from that knowledge and incorporate that knowledge, push it back into policy, we'll be in a far better place. I think at that point, I'll pause. If you have any specific questions later on the water aspects, you can come back to me. Thank you very much.
I'd like to welcome Karim Hossain. Thank you so much for joining us. Karim Hossain, if you could, can you hear me, Karim? Karim is the editor-in-chief of Agriculture for Development. Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Hello, Rohini.
Thank you for joining us. I knew you had some emergency that you had to attend to, but you made time. Thank you. And we are also joined by Salim Al-Haq. I think some of the challenges that were mentioned here, we've heard from a soil expert, water expert, and also now we have one of the top climate scientists globally who has joined us. And I know he needs no introduction, but I'll quickly go over the introduction. He's director of ICCCAD, professor at IUB, chair of the expert advisory for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, advisor to the least developed countries in the UNFCCC, and lead author of multiple IPCC reports. What I think in Bangladesh, the work that we're most familiar with is Dr. Huck's dedication to bringing the voices and expertise of marginalized communities into global platforms, particularly connecting that informal knowledge to formalized knowledge generation and policies. And perhaps it is to that maybe I can turn to Professor Huck to kind of tie in some of the challenges that have come up from David's work in soil, from Peter's work, that there has been a lag in responding to what the challenges people are facing on the ground. So there's a challenge of adopting that local knowledge, but there's also that challenge of mediating how various physical changes percolate into people's lives and reality. So there are physical changes that are happening, but the fault lines, it's over familiar fault lines. So some of the social aspects and constraints that stop us, and maybe policy and how knowledge is generating, that stop us from responding to the immediate issues. So with that, I turn to Salim Al-Haq, and Karim, please also, we would like to hear from you at the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rohini, and thanks for organizing this excellent session during the Gobeshona conference in memory of Hugh Brammer, who was a great teacher. I was one of his not formal pupils, but one of his informal pupils over many, many years, and benefited from his constant advice. I'll start by just recollecting a few anecdotes of my interaction with him, which in the last few years after his retirement, he retired to live in Brighton, and I would be in London at the International Institute for Environment and Development, and he would come up to London once a week to spend time at the British Library. And whenever he was in London, he would let me know, and we would meet for a coffee. He would come and talk to me at my office, which was not far from the British Library. And he was always wonderful, reminiscing and talking about new things that he was always working on. And one of the most enjoyable aspects of our relationship was that every time I wrote an op-ed or column in a newspaper, particularly the Daily Star, where I write a regular column, he would be the first to read it and immediately send me an email telling me where I was wrong. And we would then have a debate on, was I wrong or was I not wrong? And I loved having these debates with Hugh over the years until the very, very last days of his life, in fact. He was always stimulating, always inquiring, always challenging, and a wonderful, wonderful friend and mentor. I really miss him a lot personally. Now, in the context of what we're talking about today and the discussion in this session, I think Hugh was way beyond ahead of his time. You know, the things we are now talking about, locally led adaptation, which is the theme of the Governor Conference in the context of climate change, he had been talking about for decades in the context of development. Listen to the farmers, acknowledge the knowledge of the farmers, and learn from them rather than teach them or try to teach them. And that was his message always. And that's something I took to heart very much so. Hugh, together with Robert Chambers in IDS, was one of our gurus, a similar a friend of his as well. And so to me, we are just reinventing that particular wheel of listening to the grassroots actual people. This is now true in the climate change context just as much. As climate change impacts are now happening, people are having to adapt to them. They are learning how to adapt. They are gaining experience how to adapt. They need support and help. But we, the experts, should not assume we know what needs to be done. We need to be listening to them and then find ways in which we can support and help them. That is really the challenge that the entire Gobeshona conference and the Gobeshona platform is placing to itself. How do we improve communication between the grassroots, what I call the first adapters, the local adapters, and the scientists, the scientific community in particular? The Gobeshona platform is mainly scientific platform. It has other constituents as well, other stakeholders as well, but it's mainly for the scientific community, both national in the context of Bangladesh, but also global, in terms of how can we improve our adaptation to climate change, which is now a universal phenomena, has to happen everywhere in all countries, in particular the vulnerable countries like Bangladesh, but every country, even rich countries, are going to have to adapt. How do we gain knowledge on adaptation, which is a very much a learning by doing knowledge acquisition process and a learning from the grassroots acquisition process, which the scientific community by and large globally is not well placed to do, does not do very well. So how do we improve that? That to me is the challenge that we are placing to ourselves. Bangladesh is, I would say, relatively better. We have been listening to people like you for a long time. We heard from David the example of Hugh Brammer being invited back to become an advisor to Mr. Anisul Zaman, the then Secretary of Local Government. I remember those days myself. I was just finished my PhD and had come back to Bangladesh at that time. And so he has been doing this for some time. And, you know, even though we have not perfectly acquired all that encouragement and support and knowledge, we have been moving incrementally in the right direction. So the challenge for us now is how do we move beyond incrementally? We need to be moving much faster. We need to be doing everything at scale, bigger scale, and faster. These are the two challenges that we have. Things are happening. We cannot deny things are not happening. but they're not happening fast enough and they're not happening at scale. So that's really the challenge that I would place. I don't have the answer, but that's what I try to address. How do we scale up and how do we do things faster than we are already doing them? Thank you. I'll stop there.
Kareem, would you like to?
Thank you. This is a very, very interesting session, and I feel a bit feel that it's very difficult to speak after such eminent people and people who have worked in this field and in the subcontinent for so many years, and especially after David and Dr. Al-Hook, who I respect very much. I'm very pleased to participate in this this session. I'm sorry for not being able to join at the start of the meeting because I had a series of other obligations at IFAD today, as our president was just appointed to be the DG of the ILO, and my department in IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, is now a little bit taken up with all the arrangements for the departure and the transition and so on. But I want to say a huge thanks to ICCCAD and BIGD for their collaboration with the Tropical Agriculture Association, and to David as well, as we co-edited this volume on this special issue of Ag4Dev, and for organizing this event, which I think provides a fantastic opportunity to share the key messages that come out of Hugh's work, how to build on the experience and knowledge of rural people to inform the adaptation programs and policies that are being put in place, not only in the subcontinent and the subregion, but in the global context as well, which is absolutely important and vital. This is a fundamental concern of our approach at IFAD as well, and our core mandate at the fund, where we're currently working on the next replenishment, the 13th replenishment of the fund. And we appreciate that we are in a rapidly changing environment with multiple challenges. Not only we have climate change issues, we also have all the changes, the environmental changes that are being faced in different parts of the globe by rural poor people and farmers that are the primary beneficiaries that we work with, if you like, in our programs. And there's so many lessons that come out of the work of Hugh and of the colleagues that have contributed to this special issue of the journal that will help shape our work going forward in this rapidly changing world that we live in. Hugh was a long-standing member of the Tropical Agriculture Association, contributing important articles to Ag4Dev on the journal on many occasions. And in addition to publishing widely elsewhere, we met just once at an annual meeting of the Tropical Agriculture Association just before the pandemic. And it was great to discuss his contributions to science, to understanding livelihoods and transitions in relation to environmental changes and climate change, and further contributions to Ag4Dev, where he was keen to contribute many articles continually. He's a great loss to us in that way, and to the whole world, I would say. We had a lot of mutual understanding on the issues, and especially on the importance of participation, on the importance of appreciating the diversity of livelihoods, things on which I've spent all my career working on. And he was a great man, but very humble and acute in his understanding of science, of rural people and their diversity, and the relationships between development and climate change, and participation and development, linking then to policy, so that policies become relevant to the lives that people face in these difficult contexts. So I wanted to just say that this special issue of Ag4Dev commemorates his work and career, but with a strong appreciation of his contributions to both soil science, to participatory research methods, to livelihoods approaches, and understanding the diversity, as I said, and drawing in this wide group of fantastic researchers that we've been able to involve in this special issue, including our partners in yourselves, our partners in BIGD and in ICCCAD, to be able to emphasize the importance of the knowledge of farmers and that they have, the knowledge they have about their land, their soils, their livelihoods, and then how we feed that into policy making, taking account of diversified livelihoods, and into the recommendations and conclusions that we draw from the analysis that we do. I wanted to end by saying that Hugh underlined for me the importance of decision makers looking at soil maps and soil science and the physical environment to get information and data that's critical to decision making, but also listening to farmers, as we've heard already from David, from Peter, from Salimul, and taking account of their knowledge and their perspectives when making decisions about land use, about development policy in general, and the ways forward. And I'm really delighted that we've been able to organize this session to celebrate these perspectives. And hopefully they will influence practice and policy as we go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we actually couldn't get to the BIGD presentation. There were some technical glitches. So maybe I will turn to Adiba to do her presentation, if that's possible. Adiba, is your technical issue, has that been addressed?
I think so. If Savio assists me with the presentation,
right.
I can.
For people, I would just say that we've heard a lot from physical scientists, as Kareem pointed out. Also, the challenges of the physical scientists and the physical science and the physical world. When we talk about people responding to it, there are also added challenges of human systems and social systems and those social constraints. So as we are now move on to the perception portion of the risks, we can think about how we can also address some of the social constraints that stop us from responding appropriately to some of these physical challenges. So over to you, Adiba.
Thank you. Savio, could you move to slide 3, please?
Okay.
Ma'am, can you please make your screen full view?
Could you do full screen, Adiba, please? And maybe go a little faster than you would usually.
Yeah, of course. Savio, could you jump to the 3rd slide, please? Yeah.
All right.
So to just quickly give a summary of what we're doing here is we looked into the data set that has 33,554 representative households from the SPA data set that I mentioned earlier. We took that, and that's the data set that we used to analyze. And then there was a questionnaire in that section that had a climate change portion, which questioned the respondents on the familiarity with the term climate change, as well as questions on observed and disaggregated recent changes in climatic and environmental trends, such as changes in the temperature, flood, precipitation, and salinity. And after that, we identified some of the current changes due to climate change in South Asia, and we took this from 2 different sources. The first one being the IPCC reports from the working group 1 of the 6th assessment report, and then we also took the national reports, which was the BRAC Climate Resilient Framework, because the IPCC report only gave regional information. So we turned to the other reports. We wanted to capture some of the risks due to climate change, and we wanted to separate that from the baseline underlying physical trends. And for this, we focused on regions in Bangladesh that are identified as sites of increased risk due to climate change. And for this, we also compared this to the perceived changes, where we used the SPA data set and asked them to identify changes experienced in the last 10 years to previous decades. Next slide, please. So moving on to the methodology, what we did here is we first listed the districts that were most affected by the 3 impacts of climate change that IPCC identified as already emerging and relevant for Bangladesh. And these were changes in temperature, flood risk, and precipitation. And then we referred to the BRAC's Climate Resilient Framework in order to identify the regions of high risk. And for each of the 3 variables, we categorized the districts as either vulnerable or non-vulnerable. And then we scanned the responses in the SPA dataset in each district for those 3 variables to check if the people in the vulnerable district perceive greater risk for the relevant variable or not. And we repeated the same process for the other variables of reduced precipitation and erratic precipitation pattern, as well as erratic season change, droughts, cyclone storms, and river erosions. And so moving on to the next slide, please. So over here, we have mapped out the vulnerable regions to these variables, and we have identified that the perceived environmental change variables used in this analysis were generated from the questions on what the changes the respondents have seen in their locality in the last 10 years. So for example, for the variable increase in flooding, the value of the variable is 1, and if the respondent the vulnerable regions according to the 3 sources that we have used here. Next slide, please. Over here, we have kind of summed up how the variables that we have looked into and how the 3 sources have mapped them out. And then lastly, in the column on the far right, what we have addressed in our study. And we've seen that the IPCC states that with high confidence that mean air temperature, extreme heat days, and mean precipitation have increased. And flooding is disaggregated into coastal, riverine, and pluvial flooding. So coastal and pluvial flooding is likely to increase, whereas improved flood management has somewhat reduced the average countrywide inundation that is associated with the riverine flooding. And because the IPCC does not provide information on risk at the scale of sub-country or even country level risk, we had to check the BRAC climate resilience framework again. And the reason we looked into this framework particularly was because it is based on the Bangladesh Delta Plan and the Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy Action Plan and the Government of Bangladesh Risk Atlas 2016, as well as the nationwide climate variability assessment by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And lastly, the World Bank report from 2018. Next slide, please. Moving on to the results of our study. So essentially for the 3 variables that were identified by the IPCC, we find that people in regions that are higher, that are at higher risk in terms of increase in mean temperature, increase in flood, and increase in mean precipitation due to climate change, do more frequently perceive a change in these variables relative to the inhabitants in the other regions. So the IPCC essentially identified the main climate risk perceptions. And the strongest agreement was for temperature increase with a coefficient value of 0.81, and we have found a positive and significant but lower value for increase in the flooding. But this might be due to the fact that flooding includes coastal and pluvial flooding, which the IPCC finds to be increasing, but also includes riverine flooding, which they did not determine to be increasing. And furthermore, because the questionnaire did not include a question on waterlogging, some of the perceived change in waterlogging may have been subsumed under this variable in the SPA questionnaire responses. And what we wanted to focus on of the findings over here is that although a certain percentage of people from all the districts perceive these changes, a significantly higher percentage of people from the vulnerable districts, as identified by the BRAC report, have reported experiencing increasing in these 3 variables. And this does correspond with our understanding that high temperature, flooding, and precipitation are essentially part of the baseline climate of Bangladesh. And past experiences of these across the country could actually lead people to perceive an increase in these variables, including in regions where an increased risk has not already been identified by the BRAC report. So these changes can actually be caused by factors other than anthropogenic climate change, such as urban heat island effect and land use changes. Next slide, please. So essentially, what we have come to a conclusion from this study is that a significant portion of the respondents have perceived changes in the climatic variables that were identified by the IPCC as already occurring in South Asia, and the increased risk is perceived by a greater percentage of respondents from the vulnerable district as identified by the BRAC report. And so for some of the variables, people from non-vulnerable districts also reported some recent changes. So this could be due to the tendency to report changes in things that they have already faced. And therefore, there is a weaker perception of change for some other issues included in the BRAC report, such as, the river erosion decrease and precipitation. So essentially what we're trying to come towards is that it is not clear that these changes are necessarily due to climate change from what the IPCC and the climate models indicate. Next slide, please. So what the conclusion that we have come to, and moving forward, what we have identified is that this study does indicate a need for better communication of risks to vulnerable communities, as well as better mechanisms to inform policy with ground-up information and experiences. And this points towards a need to recognize that there are factors other than climate change pressing on the environment, and therefore those are equally and in many cases more urgently pertinent to rural lives and livelihoods. And therefore, it is essential that policies have to be designed to lessen the negative impacts of climate change, as well as be informed by the needs of the communities who are most vulnerable to climate change, and needs that may be impacted equally by immediate environmental and socioeconomic factors. And therefore, in reality, these challenges do not occur in separate spaces. So this will hopefully pave the way for further research scopes, which brings me to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adiba. This also brings us to the end of our session and time. I would like to thank everyone for being so patient with us through our technological glitches. We are just a couple minutes over time. So I would urge everyone to share their questions if they have for the panelists or the presenters, which will then be collected by Savio and then shared with us. And we can hopefully incorporate those thoughts going forward. Thank you. And special thank you to David, to Kareem, and to Peter for joining and spending, I don't know what time zone you're in, but really a huge thank you to all of you.